First of all, I would like to thank Jeff for putting together this wonderful workshop, because this is really, I think, rewarding for all of us here to find the connections and to review and revive the connections of the nerds of the North Caucasus and Central Asia, should I say. The second thing I have to say is that what I share with you are my own views, and they do not represent the views of the US government or the US Department of Defense. Also, what I would like to say is that what I share today is the continuation of my work on North Caucasus insurgencies and foreign fighter returnees from Syria and Iraq in the West. When I was finishing my first book around 2015, that's when we saw individuals from the North Caucasus popping up in Syria and Iraq. And as I was working on my second book on foreign fighter returnees from Syria and Iraq in the West, I also saw some trends, even though the Caucasus was not part of that second book, but I still saw trends in the Caucasus to Syria and then Ukraine. And so I'm sharing with you work that is both published, but also recent, based on some field work in Georgia, and also on the continuation of tracking individuals from the North Caucasus to both Syria and Ukraine. So the three big questions that I will share with you are: how do individuals mobilize into foreign fighting? How do individuals pick sides? And especially here, I'm concerned with co-ethnic groups. So mostly, well, how do Georgians pick sides, or how do Chechens pick sides? And the final question is, what do we learn about participation of veterans in other wars? There is some research on professional foreign fighters or career foreign fighters, but what we see in Ukraine also touches not necessarily on traveling foreign fighters, although there are groups of those as well, but we see the emergence of veteran groups. So individuals who fought a war in one place and then moved to Ukraine. So some broad observations. Well, first of all, if we review the definition of foreign fighters, then we could have another long conversation about whether individuals in Ukraine are actually qualified to be called traditional foreign fighters, because most of them had to sign a contract or had to register with the official forces of Ukraine. And so the traditional, or one of the traditional definitions of foreign fighters, I should say, as individuals joining insurgent groups, does not quite qualify here, because we see a lot of foreigners fighting with the official units of the Ukrainian military. Another point is that we have heard about specific groups in the last 2 days, but one thing I find fascinating and challenging at times is the different affiliations that foreign fighters choose, because one person can join one group, but then they change the affiliation multiple times before they actually travel from conflict to conflict. So I think what is important here is that when we see an individual from one group, it's not to assume that that individual will stay with the same group. And we have seen splits, for example, of the Sheikh Mansour battalion splitting from Jokhar Dudayev battalion in Ukraine. So these are common things, right? Splits among foreign fighters or among foreign fighter groups. What we have seen in Ukraine is that a lot of foreign fighters are actually training individuals and not necessarily participating in combat. And this is perhaps, again, different, because what we saw in Syria, a lot of individuals did not necessarily have military training, and a lot of them ended up in front battles. But what we see in Ukraine is some of the individuals specifically moved from the North Caucasus or other places via North Caucasus to train individuals in Ukraine. So it's the combat experience that is important here, as opposed to perhaps other reasons why individuals traveled. And one final note before the three questions is that really what we're talking about is a very small number of people It might be hundreds of thousands. It might sound like a large number, but when you really look at the Ukrainian side and the impact of foreign fighters on the conflict, it's not as significant. So in terms of future implications, I think we need to remember that these are relatively small numbers of people who might be impacting certain areas, but they might not necessarily form an entire movement. So in terms of mobilization, for example, when we looked at foreign fighters from the Northern Caucasus and Southern Caucasus going in Syria, we saw a few idiosyncratic factors as well as push and pull factors that are numerous, and Noah touched on some of them in his presentation. So there is really a lot of idiosyncratic factors, both based on individuals and also the sending regions. But for North Caucasus, as well as Georgian individuals, in the Syrian case, the Islamist ideology did seem to play an important role. Even when we're talking about individuals who joined because their friends joined or because their relatives joined, they still were impacted by the ideology of ISIS and other groups, or eventually, even if they didn't necessarily have ideological views at the beginning, they would pick them up in Syria upon arrival. For example, what I found in the Georgian case is that there were, in a way, two waves of mobilization. The first wave consisted of veterans from the Chechen wars as well as the Georgia-Russian war. And the second wave was much younger. Those were the individuals who then went after the older individuals and who were mainly recruited by the older individuals. But in a lot of those cases, it was the ideological aspect of the Islamic State and the desire to be affiliated with the Islamic State. But what I also started seeing in Syria is that some of the fighters from Georgia and North Caucasus would say, yes, I want to fight for the Islamic State, but I'm also here because I appreciate the opportunity to continue my fight against Russia. For example, Omar al-Shishani, he specifically would say, I don't have anything against Georgia because Georgia invited the Chechens during the Second Chechen War as refugees. And I don't necessarily have much against the other Christian powers, but it's Russia that I am fighting. And it's important that I have an opportunity to continue what started in Georgia in 2008. And further, when we look at Ukraine, I think this trend is becoming even more visible when you have individuals from the Georgian Legion, you have individuals from the Dzhokhar Dudayev Battalion, the Sheikh Mansour Battalion, and Ahmad Zakayev's battalion, all specifically mention that they appreciate an opportunity to fight against Russia. I have analyzed the threads from leaders of all these battalions, and what comes up are three themes. The first one is that Russia theme. It's the continuation of the fight against Russia, and it's an opportunity to fight against Russia. The second theme is forming parallels between local fights and the fight in Ukraine. To give you an example, the North Caucasus fighters from Chechnya, they claim that this is the continuation of the Chechen wars. So what we see in Ukraine, according to Isa Munayev or Ahmad Zakayev, you see that they draw parallels saying that what we see in Ukraine is the continuation of what Russia started in the North Caucasus. The fighters of the Georgian Legion would tell us that what we see in Ukraine is the continuation of the 2008 war between Russia and Georgia, and they actually see this as an opportunity to continue the fight for independence and for the occupation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And the third thing that comes up among the different battalions is the presence of Kadyrovtsi on the other side. Pretty much all of the battalions on the Ukrainian side state that Kadyrovtsi are not the real representatives of the Chechen people, that they are traitors, and that they have been fighting for the Russian regime. And this is common both between Syria and Ukraine, where North Caucasus and Georgian foreign fighters say that we do appreciate an opportunity to fight against Kadyrovtsi here. So this is the third kind of theme, stating that mobilization might be changing a bit. One question that I often get asked is, how do foreign fighters pick sides, and why do we see Chechens fighting Chechens in Ukraine? And perhaps this is self-explanatory in this audience, but what is unique in this situation is that you not only see Chechens fighting Chechens, but you see Chechens of different ideological orientations on one side. And this is pretty different from foreign fighter movements and mobilizations in previous conflicts. For example, what we saw in Syria and Iraq is co-ethnic groups joining their co-ethnics in Syria and Iraq. Specifically, we saw the emergence of linguistic battalions or the former Soviet Union battalions, where you have individuals joining their Georgian fellows or Chechen fellows or North Caucasus fellows or Uzbek fellows. In Ukraine, we have seen similar things where Croats are joining Croats, Serbs are joining Serbs, and Georgians are joining Georgians. At the same time, what we see different is that sometimes co-ethnic groups also participate on both sides of the conflict. This is not new. We can look at the Spanish Civil War, where European foreign fighters joined both the Republican side and the nationalist side, although in smaller numbers for the latter. We have seen the same ethnic groups joining different front lines in Syria and Iraq. We have seen, for example, Italians or Americans joining ISIS on the one hand, but also the Kurdish battalions on the other hand. So in a way, the fact that we have Kadyrovtsi on the one side and other Chechen foreign fighters on the other side, that's not unique. But what is unique is that you see ethno-nationalist separatist groups on one side, along with Islamist groups on the same side. And Islamist groups have traditionally avoided Christian conflicts that involve two Christian sides fighting each other. That is pretty unusual. So if for the experts of North Caucasus this makes sense, for broader reviews of foreign fighter participation, this is something new and developing. And what I argue here is that really to understand why you see these different ideological motivations is that you have to go back and look at the ideological transformations of the North Caucasus insurgencies. Because ultimately in the North Caucasus, you can distinguish between the groups of Ichkeritsi, the supporters of ethno-nationalist independent Ichkeria. So you see the similar ideas among the Johar Dudayev battalion, among the Sheikh Mansour battalion individuals. That's one side. You also see Imaratovtsi, so individuals who are supporters of Caucasus Emirate, who migrated to Syria, and some of them now appeared in Ukraine. And on the other side, you have Kadyrovtsi, who switched from the separatist side to the federal side, and you see the same individuals fighting in Ukraine on the Russian side. So in a way, this mobilization tells us that ideological motivation is one thing, but ideological motivation in the ethnic context can tell us different things about particular conflicts. And I would say this is important because if you take this idea of professional foreign fighters or veteran foreign fighters, we have seen traveling foreign fighters as long as we have had the Soviet-Afghan War, because veterans from the Soviet-Afghan War joined multiple civil wars around the world. But that was predominantly because of the jihadist ideology and the idea that you have to protect Muslim populations in different parts of the world. Some of them could not return back. We have individuals from Syria and Egypt who were forced to travel to other conflicts after the Soviet-Afghan War because they could not go back to Syria and Egypt. So in a way, you have a wave of volunteer foreign fighters after the Afghan War. And a similar thing is happening after the Syrian war, although in the North Caucasus context, some of the foreign fighters would not necessarily be traveling foreign fighters, they would be veteran foreign fighters, because traveling foreign fighters implies that you travel from one conflict to the next. And this again goes back to the definition of foreign fighters, meaning that, well, if a Georgian from Pankisi of Chechen roots goes and fights in Chechnya in the Caucasus and then goes fights in Syria, does that qualify them as a foreign fighter, or is it sort of the same ethnicity going back in history? In Ukraine, we have seen veterans from different conflicts in the North Caucasus and in Georgia. So as I mentioned, the North Caucasus insurgency gave rise to multiple individuals who are now fighting in Ukraine, and some of them have fought in Syria as well. In terms of Georgian foreign fighters, we also see the Georgian Legion that includes a lot of the veterans from the Georgia-Russian War. So in a way, I see this as displaced insurgencies. And my main argument here is that it's not necessarily individuals that are motivated to continue their ideological fight. And in a way, it's very difficult. Yesterday, we had a question, well, is Sheikh Mansour battalion, is it an Islamist battalion or is it not, right? It's very difficult to figure out the specific elements of that ideology. But what I see as a bigger trend is that displaced insurgency from the North Caucasus and from Georgia in Ukraine. Because from the North Caucasus, you have Ahmed Zakayev, who pretty much said that I am going to resurrect the forces of the armed forces of Ichkeria in Ukraine. And he publicly brought Rustam Ajiyev saying that we are now going to be one and the same group. He's also the person who in 2007 publicly split with Doku Umarov over the foundation of the Caucasus Emirate. So what I see in this bigger picture is that really, it's the consolidation of the insurgency back into one bigger thing, as opposed to what we saw in the 2005, 6, 7, when the insurgency in the North Caucasus itself started splitting into these ideological trends. Some similar things are happening with Georgia. Some of the individuals were foreign fighters in Abkhazia. Although again, whether they were foreign fighters or just fighters, that's disputable. But some individuals saw Ukrainians participating in Abkhazia. And the volunteers in the Georgian Legion sometimes tell us that it's my gratitude to Ukrainians who used to fight for us in Abkhazia, and that's why I'm here in Ukraine. And Mamuka Mamlashvili himself, he is the veteran of the Abkhazia War. He was captured into captivity by the Russians and tortured in Abkhazia. And he claims that as a formative experience for reasoning why he is in Ukraine. So I would claim that these might not necessarily be foreign fighters that we traditionally see, but these might be displaced insurgents who are using the opportunity in Ukraine to continue their fight, whether it's for independent Ichkeria or whether it's for the liberation of Russia-occupied Georgian territories. But it's the continuation of those historical grievances that were created by Russia's control of post-Soviet republics. Finally, I will say a few words about reintegrating foreign fighter returnees, because this is one of the topics that I have tracked, and from the North Caucasus to Syria, from Georgia to Syria, and from Syria to Ukraine, etc. One thing, and Jeff already spoke about it yesterday, is well, there are differences in integrating foreign fighter returnees, and those persist, period. But what we also see in Ukraine is that we see North Caucasus individuals who would probably not be able to go back to North Caucasus. And we see Georgian individuals who would probably not be allowed back in Georgia. And there are a lot of political reasons that I'm happy to explain in Q&A. But there is a lot of political opposition back in Tbilisi from allowing Georgian foreign fighters back into Georgia. So what we're facing in a way is individuals who will likely become either displaced in other countries, they might stay in Ukraine, but they might move to other countries. And these are the individuals that might be forced to become foreign fighter volunteers or foreign fighter veterans participating in a number of other conflicts, especially given that some of them already see this as an opportunity to fight Russia. So in case Russia starts other wars elsewhere, or in case there are other conflicts that involve Russia, such as Syria, for example, we might expect that these individuals who we see fighting in Ukraine today might end up in other conflict zones. So that's why reintegration and tracking and working with these individuals is essential. And I'll stop here to allow for others to speak.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again for inviting me. So I'm going to be talking today about the field work in relation to foreign fighters, both in Ukraine and Syria. So for my work, I interviewed more than several hundreds of fighters in Syria, Iraq, and I was in Battle of Mosul with Iraq Special Operation Force, and then I spent a year now in Ukraine and so on. And in Central Asia, I interviewed many ISIS folks and Jabhat al-Nusra folks. So I'm very afraid for academic research to be based on open source intelligence, which is Twitter, Telegram channel. It's a propaganda that is being fed to us. I mean, that's the whole reason of someone taking their time to run those channels. Why else would they do it, right? So, I mean, it's very entertaining to watch, but again, I don't feel like we could base any assumptions or any conclusions on that place alone, right? So what are other options for us as researchers to get the information? Basically, any resource that gives us information, I think I would take it, right? So interviews. I understand that it's extremely hard to get in contact with those fellas, and especially in a very good contact when they're actually going to be talking to you for, some of my interviews are in some, I would say 40 hours. So it is hard, but I think it's part of the job to invest in that. And again, it's not only hard, it's a language barrier and background barrier and so on. It's not that hard to find those people because again, they're pretty much on the internet. And then if you're, friends with some, they could just introduce you to others if they trust you. And, if you're working for a year with some kind of a dude who is pretty much wanted and he's not getting arrested for a year, guess what? It's safe working with you. So he would be safe introducing to others. And when you have many, many contacts, it becomes very funny because then others getting really pissed that why you didn't interview them. We're not important jihadists. Why you don't want to talk to us? It's just really weird, but they have their own standing and their own dynamics in the community that we need to also kind of think about and use for our advantage. So talking to those folks, then using kind of an undercover work, right? And I'm going to talk about ethics, security, and laws later. So, for example, just going to give you an example about returnees, let's say in Central Asia. We had, I don't know, dozens of cases when there would be a very lovely woman who was rescued from terrible camp in Syria. I mean, read ISIS female foreign fighter who went to fight and now she's back, thanks to her government that thinks that she's a poor mother of 25 kids. But she would be, nicely talking to everyone. It's oh my God, my life there was absolutely terrible. I'm so sad and I'm so terrible. And then you talk to her undercover as a fellow ISIS person, let's say. And of course, she's facilitating money trafficking, doing recruitment, talking about that, my only job is now to raise my kids so they revenge the death of their father. We also had one woman who was actually, this is a glorious case. She not sure, I think Russian citizen, but I'm not sure. She was in a camp still in a camp, being very public, crying out loud to Russian government to take her home. And at the same time, she was facilitating selling of fake passports on behalf of her husband, who was hiding in Turkey and, making fake passports for Russia and Ukraine and Moldova. She has tons of time and cell phone in the prison, so she was helping him with his side job. And at the same time, she was crying out loud that, oh my God, like my government doesn't care about me. So this is like tons of that. So I think it's very important to also address them not only as a foreign researcher, because you're going to get one picture, but also as a fellow person. And it's pretty easy to do, because if you study this conflict very well, you could pretty much impersonate an ISIS fighter if you know a couple of battles. Like it's not hard. So we had that a lot, and especially money transferring. You just write to any of them like, oh, do you know like any ISIS fighter who needs my help? And he would be like, yeah, of course. Do you help me send them money? She's like, yeah, of course. And here you go. You could prosecute them later, do whatever you want. But yeah, that's what they're doing, because a lot of returnees, especially female, they're into spreading propaganda and money transferring. That's what they're doing now. Then another way of like studying those folks, but that's just very not for everyone, to put it mildly. It's like living with them as in a cell, just kind of being really embedded for ethnographical purposes. And right now, in case of fighting, actually go fight with them. Like it would not be a case in Syria because it's illegal, but in Ukraine, pretty much you could join their group and fight with them. I was with the official Ukraine security service, so I didn't go fight with them. But again, this is very not for everyone. But in Ukraine, it's not against the law. So, but I did live with the ISIS sleeping cell in two places, in Ukraine and in Osh, in Kyrgyzstan. So another place of collecting information is prison. And here, when I'm talking about prison, there are two ways: voluntarily and involuntarily. So involuntarily, it's when a prison guard tells the inmate to talk to you, otherwise you better talk to me. Of course, we know they're gonna just tell whatever they want us to hear, right? But also in terms of prison, those guys are very good people to talk to when they are in prison with a cell phone and they have really nothing to do. I mean, great friends. Because in former Soviet Union, they have phones in prison 24/7, illegal phones, and they're very bored. So, again, if they trust you that you're not gonna give them up, that's very convenient. Because again, foreign fighters who are, let's say, hiding now in Europe or in Turkey, and with whom you want to talk, there's a problem. They're actually busy, even with legal or illegal activities, they are working full time to provide, so they don't have much time for you, which is absolutely understandable, even if they're doing an illegal job. But in guys who are in prison, they have a lot of time. So very convenient. Also, when you develop relations with those guys, as Elena said, they are migrating from conflict to conflict. And when you develop relations with them, they're just moving to another conflict. So now you find yourself in this conflict because they moved. I'm not gonna, name particular people right now because of they want to be seen right now as a freedom fighters, their own political thing. But in terms of Ukraine, for example, we had a lot of people, Westerners, who fought for SDF, and now they ended up in Ukraine. So it's a huge group of SDF guys, Westerners, who fought with Kurds. We have, again, Chechen, Caucasus guys. Again, there's just not only Chechens, Caucasus guys, and even some Central Asian who were in Syria who now ended up in Ukraine. And we have folks from Yugoslavia who ended up then in Ukraine, and then they ended up in Syria. Again, they're all migrating. They partially because they don't have anywhere to go, and other reasons that Elena mentioned. But I have guys with Abkhazia experience on Russian side who are affiliated right now with Ukraine on Ukraine side. So like all kinds of mess. So basically this Abkhazia guy is funny because I wanted to talk to him about the Abkhazia part. He's like, I'm gonna tell you about how I'm fighting in Ukraine. I'm like, no, please no. Like I need to finish a book now. So let's get to one conflict before that one. So when you develop the relations with them, they're just moving. And then it becomes really funny because, so let's take Syria again without naming names, and there would be a guy who would be giving you an interview. He was like, yeah, like I'm fighting here for religion and everything. And, you know, I'm all this religious. And then now he's, let's say in Ukraine, and he's like, oh, I'm fighting for democracy. Like that's very, very good. And what about, you know, religion, democracy does not, you know, work well together. And then he has to come up with some kind of bizarre explanation how he's like fooling a kafir into thinking that he's actually for democracy. But then of course he's into religion because you know, he had to explain it to me, he had to explain it to himself. And because he knows I'm talking to half of his group, like he's actually afraid that, you know, I'm going to tell it to others and destroy his reputation of being the fighter for religion or something like that, or for nation or for democracy. But yeah, so they are changing their ideas of what they're doing very, very often. Also because they're all migrating from conflict to conflict and they're a pretty small group. I mean, they're actually pretty small. I'm not talking about the ones in Ukraine. They're a really miserable small group. But I mean, just in general, foreign fighters who survive, they're a pretty small group and they know each other. And let's put it that way, they really don't like each other. Really don't like each other. They don't like each other as a groups. So for example, Westerners who came to fight, who were in SDF and then came to fight for Ukraine, and then they found out the North Caucasus guys from Syria fighting for Ukraine, they went home. And then and as an explanation, they were like, excuse me, we went to Syria to fight them. What the heck? Why we're on the same side right now? I didn't sign up for that. So they left. So or inside one ethnic group, they're also not best friends with each other. So when you talk to them and work with them for a long time, I mean, I think they just love talking about each other. So for the researcher, it's really fun. So I'm not saying it's useful. It's pretty much not, because now particularly one guy who came to Ukraine, like he had a problem in Turkey. He owed someone 30K for smuggling someone out of ISIS. Someone gave him money. So he basically, some ISIS guys wanted to beat him up or something like that. And so he kind of left. But everyone in the community knows that he owns someone that money or something. And now he's, again, not going to call names because they're all, it's their own business, their own community, right? But, you know, this information is pretty important when we're looking at their motivation and what to do with them. Okay, so talking about ethics, my favorite topic. Well, I'm not affiliated with academia, so I also work as an investigative journalist. And yeah, so that's how I approached that story. But again, no one went to prison after talking to me. Of those guys, well, one did, but it was not my fault. He was trying to buy a fake passport from an undercover police officer. Not my fault. So yeah, from this particular point of ethics and security, I would say the rule is if you know that there would be some imminent threat, I would notify government, but the rest, it's not my job to do, right? In terms of security, of doing that job, everyone decides himself how far they want to go. You know, no one is forcing anyone. So, but a lot of that is pretty safe, like talking to people by phone. And by the way, talking about ISIS folks in hiding, I talk to them, I hang out with them in person and by phone. And majority of them are fine telling you anything you want by phone, but they don't want to meet with you because they're afraid that they're going to be a police officer coming with you. So, which is like fine, you know, I live in the US, I live very far from you. I don't want to fly to talk to you in person either. So it's all doable actually without physically go there. The same with prisons. So for the last several years, I didn't work in prisons because of COVID. I didn't physically go there, right, because of the COVID. But although I was invited by governments to interview people in prison, but I didn't. But come on, they all have cell phones. So I still work with prisons just by cell phone. So, and again, I'm not talking about living with, you know, ISIS sleeping cells or go and fight with them. That's absolutely totally personal decision. Another issue I want to address is intelligence, counterintelligence problems, and country security. So some countries, not all countries are very democratic. So some countries don't kind of want you being there and seeing what the heck is going on. So there's one country, for example, I interviewed 10 ISIS males who bought themselves out of prison for 15, 20K. So I just interviewed them. I went there to meet with them. But guess what? Of course, security services of that country are pretty much aware why those guys are walking down the streets with a passport that says that they're absolutely clean. So they didn't quite want me, let's say, hanging out there talking to them. So that's an issue. Like I would be more worried not about ISIS guys, but about the country where they are walking free, because guess what? There is a correlation between the country and the ISIS guys walking free. And intelligence, counterintelligence. So again, talking to a lot of those foreign fighters, you kind of, I would say I would by default assume that they're working for someone's government or somehow connected to this government. Many of them. And particular, you know, some bright cases said some guy was in prison, let's say in Russia. I actually wrote an article about it. I don't remember where, but we had a guy, ISIS guy, Russian citizen, and ethnically Kazakh, who was in ISIS. He went back to Russia. He was imprisoned. He served like minor 3 years. ISIS. And then he got out and he was supposed to infiltrate some groups in Ukraine and then I think spy on someone in Turkey and I could kill someone in Turkey, something like that. But he was absolutely ridiculous, so he couldn't do any of that. And then he had everything on his phone and then he gave phone to us. I mean, like just failure of on all accounts of intelligence separation. But, you know, thanks, it was a great article. But so there are a lot of folks, for example, with this kind of weird biography, went ISIS prison, very minor prison term sentence, out, and then joined some other groups. Would be worried, right? So, and it's important even for us when we're talking to them, simply because, not for your security, I don't think something's gonna happen with them, but you need to keep in mind that, again, he could be part of propaganda. So this issue is also important to keep in mind when you're talking to those fellas.
Thank you very much. Today I'm going to present the chapter of my doctoral thesis, which looks at the mobilization of the foreign fighters from the Caucasus region to Syrian and Iraqi conflicts. Unfortunately for this workshop, I don't have anything empirical because of the British bureaucracy. I'm still waiting for my ethical approval, so I haven't conducted any interviews, but decided to present the theoretical part of my thesis, which looks at the theoretical framework of the foreign fighters mobilization. And for my thesis, for my doctoral research, as an analytical framework, I'm using social movement theory. Social movement theory is like an interdisciplinary field which looks at which tries to uncover how the mobilization to the social movements works and what are the cultural and the political and other factors that affect this social movements. But the main problem with the social movement literature right now is that the vast majority of papers cover the cases of Western non-violent movements across the US and the European world, whereas the cases outside the global West and especially the violent movements are a bit neglected, even though there are some publications on on the Islamist movements by Viktorovich, Holbrook, and others, which provide some insights into this mobilization process. And this social movements theory has been applied to the research of the foreign fighters, because the dynamics, how this foreign fighters groups interact, mobilize, and all this transnational activism has many similarities with the non-violent and the social movements which are spread across the world. So the research puzzle for my research for this chapter is that yes, the mobilization, what is the general view, like mainstream view about the mobilization of foreign fighters, especially like jihadi fighters, that some Arab bearded sheikhs come to the peaceful Muslim society, brainwash the youth, and then they go to fight to Syria or the other countries. But in fact, it's not as simple as it looks like. It's a more complicated process, and we shouldn't treat it as a series of general laws which cause the mobilization of foreign fighters. Instead, they're like a series of events that could contribute and could not contribute to the mobilization. And those who do research on the foreign fighters, no matter it's Islamists or non-Islamists, could observe the fact that there's a disproportional amount, some regions have disproportional amount of foreign fighters per capita, whereas from other regions, we don't observe any type of mobilization. Let's take the Caucasus, we have unprecedented number of militants per capita from Pankisi Gorge in Georgia, from Berekei village in Dagestan, populated by Azerbaijanis, from mountainous Dagestan, whereas places like Tabasaran region of Dagestan or Adygea Republic has not been affected by the mobilization at all. Same let's say Georgia. Georgia has more than 1,000 foreign fighters in Ukraine, whereas Moldova, which is in very similar conditions, geopolitical conditions as Georgia, has very few foreign fighters in Ukraine. So, and how can we explain this contrasting outcomes of mobilization? And yes, and when it comes to analysis of the foreign fighters mobilization, and when it comes to foreign fighters, that we have two dimensions. First is territorial, and second is human dimensions. Let's say the human dimensions, as these are the individuals or groups involved in the process. It could be the fighters themselves, the movements, recruiters, and the intangible factors such as ideology, such as identity, and other aspects. Whereas when it comes to geographic dimensions, we have two dimensions. First is the home, or the theater of war, where the war is going on. And the second dimension is the foreign dimension, or the country of the origin of the foreign fighters. It's as we have in the case of Ukraine, is like a home, and the countries like Georgia in this case is country of the origin. So, and if we combine these human and territorial factors together, we have two type of factors. Those who engage in hostilities in their own territories, and they are not foreign fighters, but hosts of the conflict. And we have the guests who arrive from the other countries. And given this geographic and human division, we could divide these contributory factors by two, the pull factors, which are produced in the host country by this host community, which intends to attract manpower from the other countries and other regions. And on the other hand, some pre-existing conditions which are unrelated to the ongoing conflict, but these factors contribute to the mobilization, push factors. So as a as a pull factors. It's like a mobilizing structures, or like a existing, which I will discuss later, mobilizing structures, political opportunity and ideology and framing, whereas the pull factors from the countries of the origin, it's like some pre-existing networks, identity and grievances. Let's discuss each of those. Like a framing and ideology. Often these two terms go hand in hand, but there's a difference. Framing theory is like developed by social movement scholars, those like Snow and Benford, and framing is like understood as interpretive schemata that is designed to interpret the events out there. And there's three types of framing which has been identified by the scholars. It's like a diagnostical framing, which intends to explain what's going on and identify the problem and its causes. Prognostical framing is like outlining the solution, tactics, and way forward to solve the problem and achieve the objectives. And motivational framing is how to inspire the followers and the potential recruits to take part in the collective action. And when it comes to ideology, ideology has like a similar attributes as framing, but it's performed on the larger scale. Like framing can be like used on one single issue, whereas ideology is performed in the larger scale. And like let's bring like an example of like jihadi movements, like the examples of framing is like a da'wah, or like a division like between us and them, like individual or collective obligations to perform jihad. Whereas like in case of the war in Ukraine and Georgian foreign fighters, it could be like a Georgia, like a continuation, a perceived continuation of war in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And yes, so that's the framing is very one of the significant components of significant contributory factors. But yes, now let's move to mobilizing structures. Mobilizing structures are the movements which exist in the theater of war, and are like a host movement which intend to attract the fighters. And the social movement literature identifies four types of mobilizing structures. Like first is informal non-movement. It's like a friendship networks, neighborhood. In terms of like a Caucasian communities, it could be like a clans, tapes, and tuhums. So these social groups are not they existed before the conflict, but they like facilitate the interaction, facilitate the communication, and then can serve as a mediator for mobilization. There's like another type is a formal non-movement, like in mobilizing structures. It could be universities, schools, in case of Islamic settings like madrasas, mosques. Like a mosque, let's say it's not built for the purpose of jihadi mobilization, but the mosque goers or the church goers can interact with each other, and this institution can serve as a important brokerage place where this new linkages and new communication can occur. Like informal movements, it's like affinity groups, activist networks, different other interest groups, which doesn't have any formal foundation, but it like exists, and it makes the process of recruitment more easier. And the final formal movements, it's like in case of jihadi movements, it's like existing jihadi Jamaat, like ISIS in Syria, or Jabhat al-Nusra. And in case of Ukraine, it's like a Georgian Legion, or Belarus groups or other groups. So these formal movements have already established, they have their own like institutionalized system, and they are designed to to host the foreign fighters in this theater of the war. And the political opportunities is very important, because political opportunities is like a set of events that perceived by these activists as the chance to achieve their political objective. And the important the distinction between those political opportunities, how provided in social movement literature, it's the political opportunities could be either created by the movements or this political opportunity can be created independently of these movements through the different set of social and economic and political events. And yeah, in case, as it was mentioned by the previous speakers, like in case of Ukraine, political opportunity could be like a fighting against Russia, or like in case of jihadi movements, it could be establishing Sharia law on the liberated territories. Now let's move to the pre-existing networks. Now to move to the factors which are produced not in the theater of war, but on the countries of the origin of the foreign fighters. So the pre-existing networks are actually the groups, the networks which had been existed before the this big mobilization, and it was easy. And what happened? Like there was. The alliance was formed between the pre-existing networks and the movement in the theater of war, which caused the mobilization, because these pre-existing networks on the ground serve as important like a bridge between the individual and the broader transnational movement. Let's take an example of the Caucasus, how the first mobilization occurred. There was Imarat Caucas, active jihadi group, and this group built the coalition with the existing groups in Syria, and then moved as part of this group moved to Syria, established Jaish al-Muhajirin wal Ansar group, and it was served as a mediator to for other individuals during the first wave of mobilization to join conflict in Syria. Whereas in some places, like let's say in Adygea Republic, we didn't have these types of pre-existing networks, and which can partially explain the low number of the foreign fighters. Same about Georgia. We had large pre-existing networks in Pankisi Gorge. That's why we have from Pankisi one of the highest number of foreign fighters per capita. Whereas if you go 20 kilometers from Pankisi in Khvareli, in the Avar villages, we have 0 foreign fighters. Why? Because we have never had any pre-existing jihadi or other networks which served as the mediator for this mobilization. And another important factor is identity. Identity is like which is important, like a set of beliefs which bounds together this community. And there is not only religious identity, which can be an important factor of the mobilization. Let's talk about jihadi groups, but ethnic identity is also very important, because even though the groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they deny the existence of ethnic identity and view it as a anti-non-Islamic concept. If you have a closer look at the groups, the way the groups are formed, most of these groups of foreign fighters are formed according to Katiba, these so-called Katibas are formed according to the ethnic identity. We have Uzbek, all Uzbek groups, we have Caucasian groups, we have Azerbaijanis, those also have Azerbaijanis who merged with Turkish groups. So ethnic identity is still a very important factor. And yes, it could be a important pull factor, or as well as important push factor, which prevents foreign fighters to join. Because let's say it's if you take the Shia regions of Azerbaijan, you have a lower percentage of recruits to jihadi movements than from a Sunni majority regions in the north. Yes, and finally, grievances. Grievances are also very important factors, and grievances can be caused by social marginalization, relative deprivation. Let's take the example of the Caucasus. It could be heavy-handed measures performed by Russian security services. And the grievances could be also divided by local and global, because if we take example of some communities in Dagestan, they might have their own local grievances, like let's say Shamil, in Shamil region, the villages like Gimri, which had very high number, very long-lasting jihadi traditions. It, for example, it started from building construction of the hydropower plant where the locals were deprived their houses and lands and were underpaid by government during the compensation, the period of compensation. So that was one of the factors of the grievances. Whereas the global grievances is like what we can observe now in Gaza, like people who live everywhere elsewhere in Canada, or let's say in Indonesia or in North Africa. All this, many of this young Muslim activists share this common Islamic grievances when we observe, let's say, today's military events in Gaza. So that's what I wanted to talk about, this contributory factors. It's still, I'm still in the process of writing this chapter, and my apologies for my poor graphic skills, but that's how I try to portray and create this matrix of mobilization, like how it affects individual and how it interacts with this mobilizing structure via different, like a tangible, non-tangible and contributory factors.